Chapter 1. The Forest Beckons. I always knew something was wrong with the forest, even as a child. The way the trees would sway and creak, as if whispering secrets too dark to be known. The way the shadows twisted just beyond the edge of your vision, teasing you with half-formed shapes that disappeared when you turned your head. But it wasn't until Jamie disappeared that I truly understood the forest's malevolence. Jamie had always been the adventurous one, the one who couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. When he set off on a solo hike through the Scottish woodlands, I'd warned him. I'd told him about the stories, the old legends that spoke of strange occurrences in those woods. He'd laughed it off, of course, said I was too superstitious for my own good. But when 3 days passed without any word from him, the police shrugged their shoulders, and I was left with nothing but my gnawing fear. I knew I had to find him myself. The morning I set off, the sky was a dull grey, thick clouds hanging low like a blanket of despair. The air was cold, biting at my skin, even through my jacket. I'd packed light, just the essentials, knowing I'd need to move quickly if I was to cover as much ground as possible. My heart was heavy with a mixture of dread and determination, and every step felt like a march towards some inevitable, unseen doom. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful, but the deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees grew taller and denser, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The undergrowth was thick, making progress slow, and every now and then I'd hear a rustle or a snap of a twig, and my heart would leap into my throat. I'd stop, hold my breath, and listen. But there was never anything there. At least, nothing I could see. It was mid-afternoon when I found the first symbol. Carved into the bark of an ancient oak, it was a strange, geometric design, almost like a star but with too many points, and lines that intersected in impossible ways. It was nothing like I'd ever seen before, and it filled me with a deep sense of unease. I reached out to touch it, the rough bark cool under my fingers. The symbol seemed to hum, a low vibration that travelled up my arm and settled in my chest, making my heart race. I pulled my hand away quickly, suddenly aware of how silent the forest had become. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something watching me, but there was nothing. Just trees, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Get it together, I muttered under my breath, forcing my feet to move. But as I continued on, I began to notice more of the symbols, each one more intricate and unsettling than the last. They were carved into the trees, into rocks, even into the earth itself, as if the very land was marked by whatever dark force had created them. Chapter 2. Nightfall. By the time dusk fell, I was thoroughly unnerved. I'd covered a lot of ground, but there was still no sign of Jamie. The shadows were long now, stretching across the forest floor like grasping hands, and the temperature had dropped even further. I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp, though the thought of spending the night in this cursed place made my skin crawl. I built a small fire, the crackling flames providing some comfort against the encroaching darkness. As I sat there eating a tasteless meal from my pack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I'd hear a strange noise, something between a growl and a hiss, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. But whenever I shone my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there, just the trees standing silent and ominous. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, staring up at the fabric above me, listening to the eerie sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, making them creak and groan like old bones. And then there were the other noises, unnatural sounds that set my teeth on edge. At one point I could have sworn I heard a voice, low and whispery, calling my name, but when I sat up and listened, it was gone, swallowed by the night. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud snap, I sat up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I unzipped the tent and shone the beam around the clearing. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light. And then I saw it. A shadow, moving between the trees just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twist as it moved. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark, hulking shape that seemed to be watching me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow paused, as if it had noticed I was awake, and for a long, agonizing moment we stared at each other across the clearing. Then slowly it began to move again, slipping back into the darkness until it was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, stoking the flames, trying to keep the darkness at bay. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last, until finally the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, and set off again, pushing myself to move faster, to get out of this accursed place. Chapter 3. The Ruins. It was late afternoon when I found the church, or what was left of it. The stone walls were crumbling, overgrown with ivy and moss. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were shattered, leaving only jagged shards of glass in the frames. It looked ancient, far older than any of the other buildings I'd seen in the area. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something about the place that felt wrong, deeply wrong, as if it didn't belong here, as if it had been pulled from some other darker world and dropped into the middle of the forest. But despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I couldn't turn back. I had to find Jamie. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the church was even more decrepit. The floor was covered in debris, fallen stones, rotting wood, dead leaves. The pews were broken, scattered haphazardly around the room. And at the far end where the altar should have been was a large, gaping hole in the floor. I approached it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The hole was a perfect circle, too perfect to be natural, and it was lined with the same strange symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. A cold draught wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it a foul, earthy smell that made me gag. I shone my flashlight into the hole, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. I couldn't see the bottom, just an endless black void that seemed to swallow the light. But as I stood there, peering into the abyss, I heard something, a faint, distant sound. A voice. "Jamie!" I called out, my voice trembling. The sound echoed back at me, distorted and twisted, but underneath the echoes I could just make out a reply, a low, guttural moan, filled with pain and despair. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees and began to climb down into the hole, using the rough stone edges as handholds. The walls were slick with moisture, and the further I descended, the colder it became. The smell grew stronger, more pungent, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from vomiting. After what felt like an eternity, my feet finally touched solid ground. I shone the flashlight around, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched out in both directions, the walls covered in the same strange symbols. The air was thick, almost tangible, and there was a low, constant humming noise that seemed to vibrate through the very stone. "Jamie!" I called out again, but this time there was no reply. Just the oppressive silence and the distant echoing hum. I took a deep breath and started down the tunnel, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Chapter 4. The Maze. The tunnel twisted and turned, splitting off into multiple branches, each one darker and more foreboding than the last. It was a maze, a labyrinth designed to trap and confuse, and it wasn't long before I realized I was hopelessly lost. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking, leading me in circles deeper and deeper into the earth. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the tunnels became. The stone walls gave way to something else, something that looked almost organic, flesh-like, with veins pulsing just beneath the surface. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the humming noise grew louder, reverberating through my skull. And then I heard it. A low growl, followed by the sound of something large moving through the tunnels. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and shone the flashlight around frantically, but I couldn't see anything. The sound grew closer, echoing through the maze until it felt like it was coming from all directions at once. I started to run, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away from whatever was following me. The tunnels seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing until I was forced to squeeze through tight spaces, the flesh-like material cold and wet against my skin. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself in a large chamber, the ceiling high above, lost in shadow. The floor was covered in a thick layer of some viscous substance that clung to my boots, and in the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in dark stains that I didn't want to think too much about, and there, lying on the altar, was Jamie. Chapter 5. The Void. His body was broken, twisted at unnatural angles, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were open, staring blankly up at the ceiling, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. I felt my stomach drop, bile rising in my throat, and I stumbled forward, collapsing to my knees beside him. "Jamie," I whispered, my voice choked with tears. I reached out to touch him, my hand trembling, but as soon as my fingers brushed his skin, I pulled back, gasping. His flesh was ice-cold, and beneath it I could feel something moving, shifting, as if his body was filled with something alive. And then he moved. Slowly, his head turned to look at me, his eyes focusing on mine. His mouth opened and a low guttural sound escaped, something between a moan and a growl. I stumbled back, horror flooding my veins as his body began to convulse, bones snapping and twisting, his skin stretching and tearing as something forced its way out from within. I watched in terror as his body contorted, his limbs elongating, his flesh splitting open to reveal a mass of writhing tendrils, each one tipped with an eye, glaring at me with a malevolent intelligence. His face twisted and merged with the others, multiple screaming mouths forming and disappearing, their anguished cries filling the chamber. And then, with a final sickening crack, his body collapsed into a heap, only to rise again, transformed into a nightmarish creature of the void. It towered over me, a mass of eyes, mouths, and twisted flesh, pulsating with a dark energy that filled the room with an oppressive, suffocating weight. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face as I stared up at the abomination that had once been my brother. The creature loomed over me, its many eyes locked onto mine, and I knew in that moment that there was no escape. This was my fate, my punishment for daring to venture into the darkness. I closed my eyes, bowing my head, and waited for the end. But the end never came. Instead, I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, and a voice, deep, resonant, filled with a terrible ancient power, spoke in a language I couldn't understand. The sound reverberated through my bones, making my teeth ache, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the very earth was responding to the creature's command. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the chamber. I was standing at the edge of the forest, the ruined church behind me, the morning light filtering through the trees. The forest was silent, still, as if the darkness that had inhabited it had retreated, leaving only the echoes of its presence. I turned slowly, my mind numb, and walked away from the church, the memories of what had happened already fading, slipping away like a half-remembered dream, but deep down I knew the truth. Jamie was gone, and so was I. Taught at Chapter 6. The Return. I don't remember how I made it out of that cursed forest. One moment I was kneeling before the monstrosity that had once been my brother. The next, I was standing at the edge of the trees, staring out at a world that no longer felt like my own. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The forest behind me was still, unnervingly so. The wind, which had once howled through the trees, was absent, and not a single bird chirped in the distance. I glanced back at the ruined church, its dark entrance a gaping wound in the earth, but the urge to flee overpowered my curiosity. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my mind a jumble of fragmented memories and half-formed thoughts. The village wasn't far, but each step felt like a mile. The trees thinned out, giving way to rolling hills, and eventually the narrow path led me back to the cobblestone streets I knew so well. The sight of familiar buildings should have brought me comfort, but instead they felt alien, like I was seeing them for the first time, or through the eyes of someone else entirely. People passed me on the street, their faces blurred and indistinct. I wanted to call out, to ask for help, but my voice wouldn't come. My mouth opened, and all that emerged was a dry croak. I was a ghost, wandering through a world that had moved on without me. When I finally reached my house, I found the door unlocked. I stepped inside, the warmth of the interior doing little to chase away the cold that clung to my bones. The house was exactly as I'd left it, yet something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. My own reflection in the hallway mirror seemed off, paler, gaunt, with eyes that were too dark, too hollow. I moved through the house in a daze, my body on autopilot. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the world outside as it grew darker, the streetlights flickering on, one by one. But even the lights seemed dimmer, as if the void had followed me home, tainting everything it touched. Chapter 7. The Descent. The days that followed blurred together, a never-ending cycle of sleepless nights and aimless wandering. I tried to resume my life, to convince myself that what I had seen in the forest was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But the signs were impossible to ignore. The first was the symbol, the same one I had seen carved into the trees. It appeared on my skin, a faint dark mark on my chest, just above my heart. No matter how hard I scrubbed, it wouldn't fade. It pulsed with a dull, aching pain, a constant reminder of the darkness that had touched me. The second was the dreams. Every night I was back in the forest, wandering through the endless maze of tunnels, the walls closing in around me. I would hear Jamie's voice, distorted and twisted, calling to me from the shadows. But when I followed, it would lead me to the same place, the chamber where I had found his body, now transformed into that unspeakable horror. And then there were the voices. They started as whispers, just on the edge of hearing, growing louder and more insistent as the days passed. Sometimes they were unintelligible, a cacophony of sounds that set my teeth on edge. Other times they spoke my name, or repeated words and phrases from that cursed language I had heard in the void. I began to isolate myself, afraid that others would notice the changes in me. My skin grew paler, almost translucent, and the mark on my chest spread, forming intricate patterns that mirrored the symbols I had seen in the underground maze. My eyes, once bright and clear, became dark and sunken, the irises tinged with a sickly yellow hue. People in the village started to avoid me, their once friendly faces now filled with suspicion and fear. I spent hours poring over ancient texts, searching for any mention of the void, of the symbols that haunted me. I found references to old cults, dark rituals, and entities beyond human comprehension, but none of it offered any answers, only more questions. The more I learned, the more I felt the void's presence, as if it were reaching out to me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I knew I couldn't escape it. The darkness had claimed me, and there was no going back. Seosu Chapter 8. The Revelation. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I found the book, a tattered, leather-bound tome hidden away in the corner of an old bookshop. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and the text was written in a language I didn't recognize yet somehow understood. The title sent a shiver down my spine. The Song of the Void. As I read, a horrifying realization took hold. The void was not just a place, it was a living, sentient force, one that sought to spread its influence into our world. The symbols were not merely markings, they were a means of communication, a way for the void to exert its will. Those who bore the mark, like me, were destined to become vessels, their bodies twisted and reshaped into forms that could house the void's power. And Jamie had been chosen. The cultists I had seen in the maze were not simply worshippers. They were part of a dark order, dedicated to bringing the void into our world. Jamie had been sacrificed, his body transformed into a conduit for a void lord, a being of unimaginable power and malice. As I read, the voices grew louder, filling my head with a chorus of madness. I could feel the void within me, twisting and writhing, a dark seed taking root in my soul. I knew what I was becoming, and it terrified me. But there was no escaping it. The void had chosen me, just as it had chosen Jamie, and I was powerless to resist. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The pull of the void became unbearable, dragging me back to the forest. I tried to resist, but it was futile. I knew I had to return, to face what I had become. The forest was different now, darker, more twisted. The trees seemed to reach out for me, their branches clawing at my skin as I pushed my way through. The ruined church loomed before me, its entrance a black maw that seemed to swallow the light. I descended into the underground maze, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly as I passed, guiding me deeper into the darkness. The tunnels were more labyrinthine than I remembered, but the void guided my steps, leading me to the heart of the maze, the chamber where I had found Jamie. But this time I was not alone. The cultists were there, their hooded figures chanting in that same ancient guttural language. The chamber was filled with a thick, oily smoke that clung to my skin, and in the center of the room stood the Void Lord, its monstrous form towering over the altar. Jamie's transformation was complete. His body had become something beyond human comprehension, a nightmarish amalgamation of flesh, eyes, and screaming faces, all pulsating with the dark energy of the void. As I stepped into the chamber, the chanting stopped, and the cultists turned to face me. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and I could see that they too had been touched by the void, their bodies twisted and deformed. The Void Lord let out a low, rumbling growl, its many eyes locking onto mine. I felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of acceptance. This was my fate. I had been chosen to join the void, to become one with the darkness. The cultists closed in around me, their voices rising in a frenzied chant. The mark on my chest burned with a searing pain, spreading across my body like wildfire. I fell to my knees, the agony overwhelming as the void began to take me. But as the darkness closed in, I saw a flicker of light, something deep within me, fighting against the void's pull. A memory of Jamie, of who he was before the darkness consumed him, filled my mind. And with that memory came a surge of defiance, a refusal to let the void claim me without a fight. With a final, desperate effort, I reached out to the light, pulling it towards me. The mark on my chest flared, the pain intensifying, but I held on, refusing to let go. The light grew stronger, burning away the darkness, until I was surrounded by a brilliant, blinding radiance. The cultists screamed, their bodies writhing as the light consumed them. The Void Lord roared in fury, its form disintegrating as the light tore through it. And then, with a deafening explosion, the chamber was filled with light, and the void was no more. Chapter 10. Acceptance. When I awoke, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun filtering through the trees. The air was cool and fresh, the sounds of birds and insects filling the silence. I sat up slowly, my body aching, but the mark on my chest was gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished skin. The memories of what had happened were hazy, like a fading dream. The void, the cultists, the creature that had once been Jamie. It all felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. But deep down I knew it was real. I had faced the darkness, and somehow I had survived. I stood, taking a deep breath, and began to walk. The forest felt different now, less menacing, more peaceful. But I knew that the void was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. As I left the forest behind, I knew that I could never truly escape the void's influence. It had touched me, changed me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend, but I had also touched it, and in doing so I had gained a measure of control over the darkness. I would carry the memory of Jamie with me, a reminder of the price of venturing too far into the unknown. But I would not be afraid. The void may have marked me, but I had faced it and survived.